Alice in Wonderland is considered to be one of the best examples of the genre of literary ravings and has drawn a lot of different comments. But apart from the beloved children's book with its many quirky characters, there's a true story behind the writing of Alice in Wonderland, and it's a lot darker than you might expect. Today we take a look at the people behind the creation of the famous story, Alice in Wonderland, and we discuss some uncomfortable questions and creepy truths. It may surprise you that there was actually a real girl named Alice on whom the story was based. In fact, many outrageous characters have been modeled after real people, including the White Rabbit, the Mad Hatter, the Cheshire Cat, the Queen of Hearts and Doo-Doo. However, even though this book is written for children, the truth behind the real Alice is for anyone but children. My name is Fred Maximoff. This is a 0500 case. Daresbury, United Kingdom of Great Britain. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was written under the name of Lewis Carroll, but no such person ever existed. Lewis Carroll is the pseudonym for Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, who was born in 1832 in England. Charles was one of 11 children. As a child he was distinguished by the fact that he entertained all the brothers and sisters with fictitious stories and games. He suffered from dyslexia and a terrible speech impediment. Charles stuttered badly. Dyslexia made it difficult for him to read. This is an amazing feature for someone who would later become one of the most famous authors of children's fiction. Despite the diagnosis, Charles tried very hard to work. He could still learn. In fact, dyslexia helped him in mathematics, and this is what helped him find a profession. When Charles got older he worked as a tutor. Later he became a lecturer at Oxford University. He is said to have been a strange young man who grew into a rather awkward and shy adult. And those who knew him described him as follows: a devout mathematician and scientist, but with a pure heart. Charles said that he was best with children. They are kinder and easier to be around than with adults. Throughout his life he often spent time with children. But at some point this seemingly harmless relationship was called into question. Charles did not often boast of great literary achievements in his youth. For example, the fact that it is published in magazines. However, he humorously said,
"I don't think that I wrote anything worthy of a real publication, but I do not despair, and someday I will do it."
The multifaceted young man seems to have been modest in his writing skills, but he firmly set goals for himself and achieved them. At Oxford Dodgson met Dean Henry Liddell, with whom he occasionally worked side by side. He first befriended the Dean's son Harry, who was 9 years old, while Charles himself was then about 30. In the days of the Victorian era there was a trend for unmarried young people in families. They were considered a kind of uncles. In the role of uncles, these young people were invited to dine or go on a trip with the family as a member of the family. It was strange, because in fact often they were not related by kinship. Charles played the role of such an uncle for Harry. He taught him mathematics and they often played together. Because Charles was an avid photographer, the Liddell family hired him to photograph the entire family. It was after this that the family relationship with Charles really blossomed. With parental permission, Charles Dodgson often took the children on excursions, picnics, or boating on the Thames. On one of the outings on July 4, 1862, Dodgson and another male colleague took the Dean's 3 young daughters on a boat ride. This was not unusual, as he had taken them on trips before. However, as they drove along the river, Dodgson noticed that the girls were bored. He tried to entertain them with a story very similar to the one he told his siblings when he was younger. The story was made up on the go. He was inspired by the girls and the things that surrounded them on a walk. He was even more inspired by the Dean's 10-year-old daughter, a dark-haired little girl named Alice, who looks a bit like the Alice that we present in today's story. In fact, Charles wrote down in his diary the exact day he met her. It was April 25, 1856, that is 6 years before the fatal boat ride. It was during this boat ride that Charles told the girls the tale that would eventually become the Alice in Wonderland story we know today. But upon hearing this fantastic story for the first time, young Alice begged Charles to write it down for her. And the next day he immediately began to write the first draft of the story. After a month of hard work, Charles again took the girls for a boat ride. There he told them his latest version of the story with new characters and adventures. After getting their approval, he began to read the story to other children and made changes. It took him about a year and he continued to add details to the tale of Alice. And the tale has doubled in size since the original draft. Charles drew illustrations for a collection of stories, drew real rabbits. He even tried to copy Alice's face from the photo in every detail. But apparently his images were never used, because all his characters always looked too sad. In order to publish a children's book without prejudice to his academic career at Oxford, Charles invented the pseudonym Lewis Carroll. This nickname was coined from his real name, Charles Lutwidge. Lewis was an Anglicized form of the Latin word Lutwidge, while Carroll was taken from the Latin word Carlos. In 1864, Dodgson gave Alice Liddell a handwritten version as a Christmas present. This manuscript was called Alice's Underground Adventures. He also wrote the following on the front page, in memory of a summer day. The first version was short and lacked some of the characters. For example, the Mad Hatter or the Cheshire Cat. He added them later. At first, Dean Liddell was excited about the story, which was inspired by his daughter Alice. It was he who suggested changing the name to what we already know as Alice in Wonderland. Prior to this, the name changed from Alice's Time in Wolfland to Alice Among the Fairies and Alice Among the Goblins. Before the story was published, Charles and the Liddell family had a falling out. This happened around the time he gave Alice the hand-drawn book. After that, the Liddell children were no longer allowed to see him. Henry Liddell and Dodgson were close friends, and the Liddells trusted Dodgson to pick up their daughters without their presence. But it would seem out of nothing, they cut off all contact with him. What could have happened between them has been a topic of contemplation for years. Many have speculated that Charles did something to Alice that cut off all communications, but there is no evidence of this. Come to think of it, it seemed that Charles was fascinated and almost obsessed with the young Alice, but the evidence is too thin to tell what actually happened between them. It is known that Charles kept a diary, but the pages where he wrote down that day mysteriously disappeared and have never been found. Because of this, there have been countless speculations and theories about what happened. The only real evidence we have that anything could have happened between Dodgson and Alice is a sudden split in communication with their family. The Liddells and parents and children did not see him for several months. After that, the Dean and his wife Larina gradually began to communicate with him again. But he was never allowed to see the children or take them on picnics or boat rides again. It's very curious what Charles could do to get Henry and Larina to remove a man from their children's lives, but still maintain a cordial relationship with him. In his diaries, Charles often wrote about his struggles with sin. He prayed to God to give him strength to resist his sinful desire. Many have assumed that Charles was writing about his feelings for Alice. But Alice is not mentioned as often in his diary as one might think. In fact, in the lyrics, he never calls exactly what he means to be sin. There were rumors that he may have proposed marriage to the young Alice, and this could have caused a rift between the Liddell family and Charles. It would be strange for the Liddell family to have 33-year-old Dodgson as their son-in-law when their daughter is only 11 years old. There is another theory that is supported by some historical evidence. In this theory, the main thing is not Alice, but rather her mother Larina. Larina was a great beauty, and there were rumors that she was secretly in love with one of her husband's colleagues. Could it be Charles? That would definitely explain why the Dean didn't want to see him around his family. In addition, the diary entries about sin can be interpreted as his thoughts about adultery and feelings for Larina, and not for Alice. But again, this is just a guess. There is also evidence of his relationships with adult women. He was not only with young girls, as many people think. As a photographer, Charles took many photographs of children. But the photographs he took of young Alice are some of the only surviving evidence of his obsession with her. The photographs show Alice half-dressed, the harness of her dress has fallen off her shoulder. It is important to remember that she is only 6 years old in these photographs. But the historical context is also crucial. All of his photo shoots were reportedly attended by her parents. The dubious remark that Dodgson wrote to the girl's mother about another daughter, who at that time was 8 years old, that he wanted to arrange a photo shoot with her. Charles wrote the following: "This chance should not be missed. We'll get some good shots of Edith's beautiful face, because by next year she might, though I really hope she doesn't, will fancy herself too old." Perhaps it was normal to express it at the time, especially since Charles seemed not a shy man at all, but in the context of today, these words are definitely disturbing. The strange photographs were taken long before Alice in Wonderland was even possible. The parents saw them and still let their daughter be around Charles for years. And we can conclude that it was definitely not this strange photo shoot that provoked a quarrel. As strange and creepy as it may sound to us, it's important to remember that when Dodgson wrote this was in the mid-18th century. The Liddells probably saw nothing wrong with Charles's interest in their daughter and the partially dressed photographs. Because the dean truly believed that no one would have inappropriate feelings or attraction to a child, it just didn't make sense to him. A year after that mysterious quarrel, Alice in Wonderland was finally published. The product was met with rave reviews. Inspired by the real Alice, Dodgson also looked at things around him and created his own magical world and absurd characters. At the same time, taking images of other people, well-known expressions, and songs. For example, to create the White Rabbit, Charles was inspired by Henry Liddell, Alice's father, who was a very busy man, always in a hurry, checking his pocket watch and often late. Also, the door in the dean's office was so small that it was called the rabbit hole. The elusive smirk and disappearing Cheshire Cat were based on other things. The phrase "smile like the Cheshire Cat" was widely known at the time. This idiom meant, to smile broadly. In addition, Dodgson himself grew up in the village of Cheshire, where he encountered the famous Cheshire cheese variety, which was often presented in the form of grinning cats. Another character is the Queen of Hearts, infamous for her cruelty, short temper, and the famous line from the book, "Chop off their heads." It is generally accepted that the sullen, legendary, grumpy Queen Victoria became the prototype. It was she who gave him the idea of a cruel and selfish character. Dudu, who only appears in the books and the earliest films, is considered a self-created character by Dodgson. Due to his stutter, he pronounced his own name as Dudu Dodgson. Perhaps the most interesting of the characters created by Dodgson was the Mad Hatter, who was added to the story right before publication. Mad as a hatter was another common phrase of the Victorian era. This hinted at a rather tragic phenomenon in history. Hatters, that is people who made hats, often used poisonous substances such as mercury to turn animal hair into felt for hats. Hatters often suffered from mercury poisoning and it literally drove them crazy. Patients had mental and physical disorders. For example, irritability, poor vision, muttering or slurred speech, muscle twitches, and tremors. Dodgson used mercury poisoning to explain why the Hatter went insane. Many have speculated that Dodgson was on some kind of substance when he wrote Alice in Wonderland. Bizarre characters and the world seemed too strange to believe that all this came up with a healthy imagination. Some believe that Dodgson was taking some kind of illegal substance while writing in order to come up with an eccentric and idiosyncratic story. If so, it was most likely opium, which was very popular and legal at the time. The characters in the book are smoking a big hookah and the smoke gets in Alice's face. The smoke in the story often distorts reality around Alice. The mushrooms in this story are also magical and when Alice eats a piece, she transforms in size. Also interesting are bottles marked "Drink Me" and cakes marked "Eat Me." Annotations to medicines are pasted on them. It all seems very strange and although it is impossible to know for sure if Charles was describing the use of illegal substances as something that changes reality in the story, the question arises. Did the writer use these substances in real life? It's entirely possible that this crazy author simply retained an innate creativity, given his talent in other areas. For example in mathematics and photography. That's why, most historians have dismissed the theory that he used some kind of substance. Instead they had a different explanation. Some said that he suffered most of his life from severe migraines. Migraines are known to cause severe headaches. In Charles's case, his migraines were allegedly so severe that he could see strange hallucinations. Dodgson's specific migraines were caused by a rare neurological disorder. It distorted his reality. He often distorted the perception of size, in particular the arms and legs. Sometimes they seemed very large or unnaturally small. Based on this, Alice often changes her size in the story. Perhaps Charles was expressing in the story how his own mind deceived him. These strange migraines were officially discovered in 1950 by a psychiatrist named John Todd and have been known as Todd syndrome ever since. However, these migraines are more commonly referred to as Alice in Wonderland syndrome. After the publication of Alice in Wonderland and the great success of the story, Dodgson began writing a sequel. A few years later, he met another little girl who inspired his second book. And what seems really creepy, she was also called Alice. Maybe he was trying to replace Alice Liddell in this way, but it was a different girl. Alice Reich spoke to Charles and talked about the reflection in the mirror. She said that everything seemed upside down there. It was this idea that inspired him to write the book Alice Through the Looking Glass. The sequel was written 6 months after the first book and sold out within 7 weeks of publication. It was a darker version of the scenes from Wonderland. After writing both books, Dodgson began to separate his personal and professional life and the life of Lewis Carroll. Whenever fans sent him letters, he didn't reply or even read them. Instead, he simply asked them to be returned to the sender. It seems that despite his outlandish writing style, Dodgson himself was rather quiet and introverted. There were many ups and downs in Charles's life, but he soon came to his sad end. Charles contracted pneumonia and his life ended in 1898. But what happened to the real Alice? Everyone knew she was the inspiration for the story. It was no secret that Dodgson wrote the story for and about her. Her photographs were everywhere along with the book so people knew what she looked like and where she lived. She struggled to avoid popularity and Alice in Wonderland questions. Just like Charles, Alice is tired of the attention associated with this work. For most of her life, Alice refused to even talk about the subject. In 1928, she did sell to an American dealer an illustrated book that Dodgson given for her. The cost of the book was £15,400. In terms of modern money, this is more than $20,000 US. The book was later returned to England and is now in the British Museum. It was only when Alice celebrated her 80th birthday that she began to accept the association of herself with the book. 2 years later, Alice's life ended at the age of 82, but her legacy lives on. Ideas that Dodgson had misplaced feelings for Alice have survived to this day. Although there is no evidence for this, Dodgson is reported to have repeatedly denied in his final years that any particular little girl was the muse for his famous character Alice. The audience disputed this claim due to the fact that Alice Liddell's full name was included in the poem and tagged at the end of the Looking Glass book. But Dodgson objected and said that it was his usual practice to dedicate poems to various girls he knew in real life. A man named Vladimir Nabokov, who translated Alice into Russian, said that the story of Charles and Alice was very similar to his own novel Lolita, written about an adult man who was very infatuated with a young girl. Charles was both a gifted writer and mathematician and a shy man who preferred the company of children to adults. If there is anything else good or bad about it, we may never know. We cannot know for sure what caused the quarrel between Dodgson and the Liddell family, a quarrel that irrevocably ruined their friendship. But what we can say with certainty is that the world of Alice in Wonderland has a story that is no less interesting than the fantasy story itself. Do you want to know what Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast hides in itself? Then let's get 2,000 likes on this video and I'll create the next terrifying fairy tale story for you. In the meantime, watch next exciting video and subscribe to this channel.